Okay, let's get started. We're 3 minutes past, according to my clock. There's still a few people coming in, but I'm sure they can catch up. So welcome to this month's installment of the Medieval Academy of America's Digital Humanities Committee monthly showcase, which is timed to coincide with the centennial year of the Medieval Academy. So each month we're showcasing some digital humanities projects. This month, we have two speakers who are going to be talking about digital heritage projects. We've got Ed Triplett and Gary Dempsey. I will introduce each of them before they give their presentations. Questions can be put into the chat function. We'll hear from both our presenters and then open it up to discussions. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat for questions for our presenters to be which can be discussed at the end, but I'll keep an eye as well if anything more pressing comes up during the presentation as well that needs to be addressed while they're speaking. So I'll just do a couple of very quick housekeeping announcements right now, and then hopefully we'll remember to do it at the end as well. So I'm Vicky McAllister. I will be the incoming chair of the Medieval Academy's Multimedia and Digital Humanities Committee. Rowan Doran is will be the sadly soon to be outgoing chair of this committee. So we are the committee tasked with representing the digital humanities in the community of medievalists. So we are hosting this monthly showcase. Our first was last month. We do have others already scheduled that are upcoming. There isn't one for next month because next month is the MAA's annual meeting. And instead we're hosting a coffee hour. If you're going to be attending the MAA's meeting, please consider attending the DH coffee hour. There's details in the program, including the location. Instead, our next online webinar will be on April the 18th, where we will hear about Edition Crafter and Mapping the Medieval Woman projects. And then on May 16th, we will hear from Books of Duchesses and Medieval Anglo-Jewish Woman, 1154 to 1307. I'll remind you of those dates, hopefully at the end as well. Okay, so let's get started with our first presentation. And that is from Ed Triplett. Ed Triplett is an assistant professor of the practice in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies at Duke University. His research has focused on the historical visualization of medieval and early modern borders, the architecture of Iberia's military religious orders, and how GIS, procedural 3D modeling, and game engine systems can be used to answer landscape scale questions about the past. He teaches courses on the design and construction of castles, monasteries, and cathedrals during the Middle Ages, and on the use of GIS for mapping historical subjects. Ed has been a core member of the Digital Art History and Visual Culture Research Lab, DAHVC, at Duke since 2016, and he is currently developing a 3D mapping project that reconstructs an early 16th century codex of Portuguese castle plans and perspective drawings known as the Book of Fortresses. So I will mute myself and let you take it away, Ed. As before, any questions, please pop them into the chat function.
Great. Thank you. We'll pull this up. Click over share. There we go. All right. Hopefully you all can see things fine. Good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Vicky, for the invitation. It's great. This is a really interesting group, and I see some familiar names in the participants list here. So some of you have actually heard some of this presentation before. So this is exciting. This project is just very simply known as the Book of Fortresses project. I'm going to talk to you. It's not an easy project to describe in 10 to 15 minutes, to be honest with you, because I've been working on it for so long. So what I want to do in this presentation is just really give you all a sampling of the different kinds of techniques and processes, introduce you to the source that's actually been the main reason for the project, and doing a really source specific digital humanities project in this way has its own challenges, I think. So I just really hope that you all are kind of, provoked by that whole thing. So what is the Book of Fortresses? The Book of Fortresses is quite literally a codex of drawings of castles and fortifications on the border between Portugal and Spain, that was drawn in about 1509 to 1510. It's this most kind of richly annotated version of it, known as Codex A, is in the Torre de Tombo in Lisbon, so in the National Archives there. It contains 120 perspective drawings, as you see here, and these all fall into this category, sometimes referred to as, in later periods, as chorography, after the Ptolemaic description of choros. So these are very place-based images. There is no map in the book, and this is something, frankly, that I just kind of discovered during my dissertation research, somewhere back in like 2015 or 2014 or so. And I remember discovering this thing while working on a different project that was also spatially oriented about military order architecture in Spain and Portugal throughout the Middle Ages. And I remember my advisor just saying, "Hey, that's really great. Don't work on that right now. That's your next project." And so I started working on this really about 2018, and I'm really ramping it up in different phases over time. So who is the author? He's a bit of an enigma. His name is Duarte de Armas. We know that he was a squire in the court of Manuel I of Portugal. We know what his job essentially was, what he was tasked with by Manuel I, which is he's trying to assess the condition of the border fortresses between Portugal and Spain in 1509. He was also trained in cartography in Lisbon. That is, there's only one kind of reference to him in that way. I also really think that he's probably best described as a surveyor more than, because what is a cartographer really in early 16th century Portugal? It's kind of hard to define in that sense. He's also, I think, a military architect. And one of the things you can see about him is that he isn't shy. He puts himself into his drawings 19 times. He has this person that he travels with. He's always on horseback. There are these poles that they're carrying that are about 3 varas long, and I mention that because one of my hypotheses is that they are using these spears as really simple and fast measurement devices, and that the vara is a very important thing because Manuel I himself, that is the Portuguese yard that he defines shortly before this time. And so I look at this as an example of what we might call inscribed power. So Manuel I literally wants to send someone out there from Lisbon to measure in his own units what the border looks like. And so my first move for this project was I think quite obviously, to map it, right? Since there's no map in the actual book, let's figure out where all of the castles are, where they're, how they're distributed, do some basic understanding about how well connected they are and that kind of thing. And that's just the GIS, so Geographic Information Science process. And I think what's so interesting about it and why it's so worthy of close reading really is that the book is just such a rare survival. There are it's so consistent in so many ways. There are so many drawings. It's very consistent in that there are 2 drawings of each site plus a plan of almost every one of these locations. This is also a really interesting moment where I'm less caught up in these debates, but it is in a moment in which is it in the medieval period? Is it beginning to be in the early modern period? And for people who study castles, it's in this. There are some problematic terms like proto early modern or proto fortification. They are just beginning to make transitions in fortification architecture to account for firearms. But in this view of these in 1509, they very much represent the way that they might have looked even 100 years before. So it is a great a great source of information about the way that borders were even conceived of at this time, as well. And I think it's also such an early example of chorography that it's quite an excellent way of looking at that kind of material. So some of the things that it deals with are the concept of what is the medieval, what is the early modern, what does it mean to make some images that capture place versus space. What are these thresholds and borders? How would you know when you've crossed between Portugal and Spain at this time, or Castile, for instance? And those kinds of issues, I've tackled these in a few ways, and I've had a whole lot of people working with me, mostly undergraduate and also graduate students, and another colleague of mine as well, kind of working with me on this. And we've moved between GIS and CAD. All right, so these are maybe words that aren't super familiar to everybody, but maybe this audience may be a little bit more familiar. This is, are you working at the local level, at the architectural level, at the landscape scale, or are you working at a geographic or peninsula scale, and working between those things and noticing that a single source like this is operating at a lot of scales is a challenge. And we're trying to make the case with a project like this that your software choices are very important, because these software packages are not designed for us as historians, as art historians, right? They very much privilege the idea of comparison between the modern and the medieval, or the modern and the historical, let's just say. And maybe they excel at that, but if we are operating with visual documents that don't georeference, that don't lie over top cleanly in a Cartesian system, then what do we do? So we tried to solve some of those kinds of questions. And so the very first thing to do for me was just go out there. So I started going out and doing just on-site photography, trying to generally figure out, okay, can I stand roughly in the same position that Duarte de Armas might have been standing? And that what was really fantastic about that is right off the bat, 2017, I'm like, this is a combination of observational drawing and cartographic principles. So he is not making one drawing. This is not in one point perspective, right? None of that kind of stuff that we might have assumed going in. And most importantly, that it's a composite image, that there isn't even one vantage point. What he'll do is stand on multiple hillsides and seamlessly sew the image together, because his goal is not to present to Manuel I, this is what I saw. His goal is to say, this is what's there. And that's an important distinction. So the photography got us pretty far. We started 3D modeling early on. This was really intriguing too, because while he really meticulously measures and annotates his plan drawings of the interior, so we might call it the inner ward of each castle, none of those drawings are actually what we would call to scale. So he says exactly what they are, but he also does them in a schematic form. So if you actually take him at his word and 3D model directly from them, it's almost like playing a game of telephone. By the time you get all the way around the walls, they don't line up anymore if you use his measurements. So that was kind of an interesting thing that's going on. But we could still, at the same time, produce some things that help us understand the correlation between the perspective drawings and his plans. At the landscape scale, so that's at the architectural scale. At the landscape scale, one of the things I started doing is moving to 3D GIS, putting up these three-dimensional billboards. So this was especially important, I think, in 2020, 2021, when I wasn't really able to go out there to test some of these hypotheses. I would go into this 3D GIS system and start trying to play with the location of these images and see, all right, how can I possibly line these up? How many different vantage points are being sewn together? And then at the National Peninsula scale for this project, it was really interesting to me to compare this kind of node-based, much more medieval or early modern sense of border formation, which is, where your knowledge of that you have entered into a new country or a new kingdom, let's say, is much more important what castle you might be seeing than it is that you've crossed some sort of imaginary line. And on the national scale, like GIS operates under this idea that we have linear borders for the most part, and we have to sort of hack the software a bit to start adding that ambiguity. So I started just playing around a little bit with things like viewshed analysis to figure out just how well covered the landscape was from these positions. Is that one of the goals? Is that what qualifies as a border fortification, that it has a very wide viewshed of the landscape? Another thing that gets said all the time that I think is really not necessarily appropriate for this time period is this concept of chains of fortifications, or castle chains, implying that there's a signaling system and that these fortifications were intervisible with each other, and that they create this kind of line that, again, our desire from the sort of modern nationalist perspective, that there is some threshold that you have to cross when you go between countries, that wasn't really necessarily true. And that also leads with more three-dimensional data. We started doing some drone scanning with photogrammetry. You can kind of see that on the left-hand side, just to be able to try to compare some of his drawings to the like a dense data capture of what's there. At the landscape scale, we moved on in 2020. Again, a really tough time to get an NEH grant. From the Office of Digital Humanities, we got this grant to, instead of working within a CAD system or a GIS system, we decided to move into a procedural 3D modeling system, which would essentially translate, if you annotate the image, it would translate the images from 2D into 3D, and do this for people who are simply able to detect that what an object is, and classify it, and then rather than somebody with a ton of 3D modeling experience, you would be able to maybe visualize these things that way. That's what's known as the Sandcastle project. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But it's kind of its own thing that's moving into doing this for lots of choreographic images, not just the Book of Fortresses. And then at the relational database side, which I think really in some ways probably ought to be closer to the top, that's another place that we began, and that simply meant, if we're going to do a really source-specific bit of research, we want to extract as much information, especially when there's so little textual information in the book. There's like a tiny itinerary in which he says where he went and how many streams he crossed, and if the roads were any good. But other than that, he says nothing in text about the experience. So we tried to structure that visually with a set of classes and tags using a web application called Airtable to do that kind of relational database work. And that meant, that's kind of an image of it here. That meant doing some things like doing translations. And one of the grad students in our program, Brittany, who I think is on the call here, actually went through and translated the little bits of text that were inside the images, and made that annotation work online for us. And also looking to see if there's going to be any correlations between historical events and imagery that's in here. And one of the things that Brittany was looking at was whether or not there was an instance of a foral novo. So a foral novo is like a new town charter. And if within a few years before 1509, if a town had gotten a foral novo, we cataloged that, Brittany cataloged that. And then one of the things that I noticed in the imagery is that if it got a foral novo, it also got a pillory. And that pillory then therefore was kind of a bit of an insider cartographic symbol that, yes, this is a site that has a royal town charter, and that the king is in charge. And so I'm running a little long here, so I want to make sure I just sort of very quickly show you some interesting images about the way that we did this. The 3D GIS system is a way that we can zoom way in and start asking some questions about, again, this question of chains of fortifications. How frequently did Duarte de Armas even care about connecting these sites to each other? And were there frequent intervisibility, examples of intervisibility, as you might see here in the final image, that in white, those lines, those are sites that can see each other. But in a lot of those sites, he doesn't mention that those sites can see each other. It's not really an important goal for him. So that I thought that was kind of a useful thing. This is the shameless plug of the of the project website. So if you're curious, you can go to bookoffortresses.org and see you can navigate these things in the 3D ArcGIS online system. The Sandcastle workflow also has its own project. This is where we are starting to scale up and do some things with medieval and early modern chorography, and we're really still at this level here where we're trying to translate those images programmatically into 3D models, and that's actually been moving quite well very recently. If you're not familiar with procedural 3D modeling, these two little GIF files will kind of tell you what we're talking about. It's for if you have a limited number of classifications and tags for different kinds of things that might be in a map like that, you would be able to render them quickly. And then this is sort of that last idea. I know this can be a little bit difficult for people to understand, but we're sort of sacrificing one conceit, which is that the Cartesian system doesn't work, and we're separating that out and saying, all right, let's accept a totally different conceit, which is we're going to treat the thing like it's a camera, and we're going to project the image onto the landscape and reconstruct it that way. So just knowing little things about this at the very end of this video, and then I'll conclude. I just try to show you how we did some pretty simple math to make sure that as the objects get closer to the camera, they get smaller or larger, the correct scale, and this keeps things as a little bit more of a direct, I would say, translation. So we have some conclusions about the project, about things that we've learned about his decision making that I can elaborate on, and I think in the Q&A. But I really want to make sure that I get to this slide, which is the thank you. So there is a really big team. This doesn't actually represent everybody. This is people who really contributed a lot to this project over the years. So we've had some internal grants, and as well as the Office of Digital Humanities grant to sort of move from Book of Fortresses to Sandcastle and develop from within. But that's in a whirlwind, that's the project. And I'd be really happy to answer questions in the Q&A.
And thank you very much, Ed. Okay, so next up we have got Gary Dempsey. Gary is the co-founder and creative director of Digital Heritage Age, DH_Age, a collective dedicated to integrating technology with cultural heritage to enhance community engagement with heritage. Since 2010, Gary has been active in heritage management, focusing on community-driven heritage projects and digital preservation initiatives. He also serves as a lecturer at Atlantic Technological University, ATU, in Galway City, teaching modules in heritage, animation, and games. Okay, Gary, you are.
Thank you. Hopefully I just find the right page here. And that's great. So hopefully you can see that. Yeah, so as you said, I'm one of the co-founders of Digital Heritage Age. We're a group that was kind of set up initially that we wanted to do digital heritage projects, and then developed our goals and our ambitions out of that. At a core essence, we want to protect and promote heritage and preserve a record of that heritage. And I'll talk a little bit about preservation as I go through the talk, and how we look at the ideas of digital preservation and what that actually is, and how we promote it within the work, and the limitations of that as well. The kind of the roadmap of what Digital Heritage Age is, we founded in about 2014. This was through a community training project in County Roscommon in Ireland, where I'm from. And it was something that when I came back from working with Digital Design Studio in Scotland at the Glasgow School of Art, that I wanted to develop the same type of projects that we worked on over there back in Ireland as well. I met Orla Peach Power, who at that time was at University College Cork, and we got to talking about different projects that we could do and different digital projects that we could develop out. I'll talk about one of those in a little bit more detail, the Shield and the Gate 3D project, and how that kind of became a founding goal for us to go out and do something. The goals of Digital Heritage Age are very much to explore and record. I sometimes joke that I'm a bit of an antiquarian. So we're just creating catalogs most of the time, but we're trying to reveal interesting stories or interesting aspects of heritage, and then using digital technologies to promote all of that. A lot of what we do then needs directed funding. Um, it is mostly community funding that we get, and then some research grant base that I'm able to apply through Atlantic Technological University through. And then we've developed our own kind of projects. So we began with Roscommon 3D, Sheila 3D, and the Palace Boy project are projects that we've worked on. And then we've been very lucky to get to work on things like the Omen 3D project or the digital atlas of early inscribed carved stones, which is also the digital atlas of early Iron Age stones. And we've just released those on Sketchfab. Just this weekend, we got permission to release those. So the ideas that we're trying to promote very much are preservation and stewardship. By creating the catalogs that we're creating, we are recording at a very high quality using photogrammetry or laser scanning the subjects. So be they cross slabs or be they high crosses or be they stones, there's a high level of quality and a measurable detail in each of those. A lot of the objects that we're recording are very much at risk. So risk of weathering, also at risk of being lost over time. So a lot of the catalogs we go through, there's something missing, but it has been recorded in the past in the 18th or 19th century. We try very much to incorporate the metadata and paradata. So the metadata you're probably all very familiar with. It's the data and how we've collected it, and it's the catalog and the kind of the nomenclature that we're using. The paradata then is there, so when we go back and we want to do this project again, we can compare that to the conditions. So that could be, was it raining on the day? Was it sunny on the day? What type of memory card we used? What type of camera we used? But also then the choices we made of the placement of where those cameras were and why we made those choices at the time. So sometimes when you get to a site, there might be limitations like barriers around the site, or you might be on scaffolding, and those things are not recreatable in exactly the same way again. So we just try and record as much information. And then we try and promote sustainable archiving. That can be difficult, especially if there's no funding for it, but it's something that we try and promote as well. That's kind of our goals as being archivists of these catalogs. When it comes to promoting all of this and making it available to people, it's mainly 3D scanning that we're using. So 3D scanning using photogrammetry, which is just photographs stitched together using specific software, or laser scanning as well. So we have access to a number of terrestrial and a number of hand scanners. And then we use aerial survey or aerial photogrammetry as well, whenever we have access to that type of software. That helps us to build these catalogs. And usually most of the work on any of our projects is actually building those catalogs from the ground up. So the current project I'm working on is 12th century churches very much in the west of Ireland. We have a 14th century papal record, and the working kind of hypothesis is that anything on that record should have existed in the 12th century. If we survey all of those sites, we can then find 12th century stones or any evidence for that. And then we're creating a digital catalog of each one of those stones. When it comes to kind of the broader projects we try and work with, we try and let communities lead all those projects. And that's where we want to really place the most focus on our work, is that, well, I want to come into a community and record something or to learn something from them. It needs to be community led, and I actually need to leave something behind for the Digital Heritage Project to have any real value. So leaving behind skills through community training is a really important aspect of what we do with our projects. So when it comes to community focused projects, I think the biggest thing I learned on our journey as a digital heritage company was we really do not own any of the projects. And that goes for any research that you're going to work with a community group. It might be your research, but you don't own the heritage behind that, and you don't own any of the information that you collect from that. So we learned this through the Omen 3D project. So we ran a virtual heritage network in Ireland between 2014 and 2018 or 2019. And the Cork Agreena 3D project spoke at one of those events in Cork and very much presented everything as their project. And I think it was kind of a wake-up call for us as digital recorders, and then the people running the Omen 3D, that it really was the community project, and we were just there as part of that, working with them. The Roscommon 3D project was something that it built out from those initial training courses that we were hired to do, and has since kind of developed into something that the heritage officer in Roscommon very much leans back into. And because we have the passcodes and the access into the hosting accounts, we'll often get a request to incorporate someone else's data into that as well. The idea of a community project in Cork Agreena is still ongoing and developed into a community-led project. There's maybe 2 or 3 people working on that, and Digital Heritage Age will help them to host the models, or we'll do some additional processing and jump in whenever they require us to do that. The Roscommon 3D project very much failed as a community effort. There was a few additional aspects that came out of it. We were asked by one particular community group where we recorded some cross slabs and some high crosses in their area, would we come back and do some headstones? And what actually ended up happening was they asked me to record a number of stones that they had identified as potentially being medieval in date. Looking at them, you wouldn't think there was anything on them, but when we actually recorded them, they turned out to be some very beautiful high crosses or remains of high crosses closely connected to Clonmacnoise. So after that, the project that community group were finished with their aspect of it. We didn't get another community group to come in, but again, the heritage officer still very much develops that project, and we kind of lean back in once in a while. To make any of these community projects authentic, it really has to be the communities who want the research. Sometimes we can design a project and develop it and ask for a community's letter of support when we're going for funding. But one of the key aspects, and whenever I talk to the National Museum, or in particular the ICANN, the Irish Community Archive Network project, I'm always reminded that we have to give something to the community. So you can't just say, I want your letter of support. You have to say, I will offer you this and we'll collect this together. So those type of aspects tend to be at the core of what we try and promote and what we try and engage with all of our community-focused projects. When it comes to our own research, then, they're much longer-term, sometimes ad hoc projects. So Sheila 3D started it was probably the end of 2014. We began recording. We started to get funding by 2015 up to about 2019, and it's been very ad hoc from that point onwards. So if you're looking at the map here at the moment, any of the blue ticks, they are recorded sites. Any of the red X's on the map, they are sites we have not got to. So there's only about eight carvings left to record in that. Some of those are new finds that are still going through conservation, and we're just waiting to get access. And then all of the other dots, the question marks, are sites we have to go and visit because someone has reported a potential carving there. Anything that's green is actually a modern carving that we've been able to identify. And then some of the other ones are missing carvings that we're hoping to find over the long term. So this very much sits as a back burner project. When we go out and work with a community, we incorporate that into a national project called Digital Communities or Digital Counties. And that project got supported by Sketchfab, who are the 3D hosting website we've used for quite a long time. So each county has its own web page on that. So if you look up Sketchfab, Roscommon 3D, or Galway 3D, or Carlow or Cavan 3D, there are dedicated pages. And whenever we work with a community in that area, we upload that county's models to that collection. The recent in 3D projects that we've worked on, they've come in on that Digital Counties project. So when we've done Kilkenny or Cork, we host the models there, and then they also host them on their central database as well. We use those projects then to get access to things like the Shield and the Gig project, or any other project we might be working on that we're trying to fund ourselves, because the local communities have better connections with certain landowners, where it, like, for instance, there are several Shield and the Gigs in private ownership, and the local communities have been our only access point into that. So again, giving something back to the community has allowed us to gain that access and develop these projects a little bit more. In terms of how we fund the projects, initially we could actually apply ourselves for things like Heritage Council funding. So if you're not familiar with the funding structures in Ireland, we would have state funding from the Heritage Council or National Monument Service, and they have set aside X amount of money for community grant schemes or for particular focus schemes like the Irish Walled Towns Network. And during the initial phases of 2014 to about 2016, as a research group, we could apply directly to those, and we didn't have to have communities involved. Later on, then, that very much became a focus of community grant schemes. So you need to partner with a community group in order to apply for any of these schemes. And that goes for the things like the Heritage Stewardship Fund. Universities can apply to that. So ATU, where I'm working now, can apply to that. And projects like Adopt a Monument or Heritage Council projects, that the community can approach you, but then they might still need to go and apply for the Heritage grant scheme itself. Creative Ireland is a very similar structure there. That is much more arts focused. And that's led to a new kind of output for a lot of our projects, where not everyone can access or engage with the 3D digital models. So we've started to incorporate traditional artwork, very much inspired by 18th to 19th century artwork or archaeological drawings, that enhance the work that we're doing and actually have something physical to give back to the community. So we've been able to balance those community-focused grant schemes with other schemes like the Royal Irish Academy or Royal Society of Antiquities of Ireland, who will give out directed grant schemes. So the Royal Irish Academy actually have a digitization grant. I haven't applied for that one myself in the last couple of years, but it's one I keep meaning to develop a scheme to apply for that. But we've been successful with the Archaeology Research Grant and the World Heritage Research Grant coming out of that. So the Royal Irish Academy, they're very small grants, but they allow you to get something from a project and to get something over the line. The problem with this funding structure is that everything is March to November. So you spend December through to February designing your projects, working with communities, writing the grant applications. You hear about it in March, whether you're successful or not, and you have to complete that by November. If it's a Heritage Council grant, you have to have an event during Heritage Week, which is the last week of August. So it puts a very tight constraint onto your actual research. And if it's an academic project, that can kind of slow things down. So again, leading them as community projects and building them into larger research works a little bit better for us. So generally, we design our projects through like a little roadmap. We'll generally come up with an idea. We will go away and research that idea, see how practical the project could be, and then we look at our funding options and go out and do field work. So the current project I'm working on is part of my own PhD research into stonemasons. I've been lucky to get 3 strands of funding that have allowed me to look at counties Roscommon, Galway, and Mayo in the west of Ireland. And I've been able to build up the mapping and the GIS aspect of that just through my own research and being able to go for small funding grants. And when I say small, we're talking about maybe €1,000 or €1,500. So not a lot of money, but at least allows you to get funding for a particular passion project or a research project over the line. When it comes to more community focused projects, we really have to think about what can we give back to the community. I'm lucky to live in Galway in the west of Ireland, and we have a very great heritage officer here. She has wonderful connections with community groups, and if we generally have an idea, we can contact her and say, oh, I want to create a mapping of coastal erosion of heritage sites across the west of Ireland. And she will link you with community groups who are already interested in this. Or we want to go out and we want to look at island heritage and recreate the antiquarian drawings of Dunor, someone from the Ordnance Survey maps. And again, we can develop projects around that. So that's generally how we focus our projects and focus our ideas behind projects. To fund all of that, we do a lot of commercial work. So the commercial work is very much training and CPDs. So we might get a phone call that something has been discovered or they're working on a site conserving a building, and they want a particular aspect of that building recorded. So it might be all of the windows on a tower house, or it might be a particular object that's been found on that site. So state bodies, museums, archaeological companies will often contact us to record something, and that's very much at short notice. So you might get a phone call on a Monday or Tuesday, and you have to record it in the next week or two. We'll generally build the digital model as a direct output of that. So once you record it, it's ready in a day or two, and you can be promoting that depending on the site and the permissions that you're allowed to share. But we can generally promote that within a few days. And then we'll design a report and a building survey out of that. The commercial training work, then we will often link to our other funded projects. So if we're working in an area, we'll try and bring a community group into that. And then anything we make from that is then reinvested back into Digital Heritage Age and back into the projects again. We have a number of core challenges, mostly to do with storage. Currently, I have a top drawer of my office desk here, and when I open it up, there's about 30 terabytes of storage of all the projects we've worked on since 2014 on multiple external hard drives. And we have X number of online accounts where we can use cloud storage, but there's a limit to what we can store and what type of information we can store. So all of that 30 terabytes of data is the actual field survey data, the original images, the original metadata and paradata, all stored on hard drives. And then we might take the 3D models and store those online. The goal of storing literally everything from raw photos to processed photos to the processed photogrammetry or processed LiDAR is that as that technology gets better, we can go back and we can do that again, and we can then get a better model, or we can see more information from older data sets. And we try and update that storage every so often. So at a 2 or 3 year period, we will take all those drives and we'll save them onto a new set of drives or a new server. So we try and ensure while we're doing that everything is using open formats and that it can be recovered or conserved during that time. So by using open formats, we should ensure that data can be opened up in the future. But it doesn't mean that some of those open formats might not be accessible in the future again. There was a cross-lab project run out of the University of Galway in Ireland, and the data was all saved as a PDF file, so 3D PDFs. They also were hacked in about 2019 or 2020 and lost all of that data. They didn't have it backed up, or they didn't know where it was originally stored. I had sometime around 2016 or 2017 downloaded all of those PDFs. And currently I'm going through each one and converting them to open source formats like OBJ or STL files. and then creating a model that can be stored online, and then giving that back to the university. It's a long project, but I think it's something I'm putting my own free time into, because that was an amazing project. And if we lose that data, it's a big loss to Irish heritage. We have a reliance on commercial companies. So like I say, we host a lot of things on Sketchfab. Anybody that uses that site will know that it's moving now to Fab. So just taking out the Sketch and moving to a new platform. And that will become problematic, because that's not as easy to use, or it's not as user friendly. It's designed to be a lot more commercial. So we're looking at alternative options there. But we're very lucky in that in the European Union, there are a number of projects like Europeana, the Discovery Program, who are based here in Ireland, that those type of things are being discussed at higher levels than we can even imagine. And we're able to feed into that, and then to benefit from those things as well. I always say to people, when we're doing digital projects, I always ask them first, why do you want us to be digitally recorded? Is it just to have a nice 3D model, or is there a question you're trying to answer? But any of the information, we have to plan for that information to get lost at some point. So we will generally provide the client with an output file, and then we try and store everything, that if they ever lose it, or if we ever lose it, that there's a backup somewhere that we can access, and we can process the original data again. So I'll just show you a couple of the projects that we've worked on here.
Sorry, Gary, to interrupt you. Sorry,
Yeah.
we've only got about 10 minutes left in the session, so
I think I have only one slide after this.
Perfect, great.
Yeah. So these are just some of the projects we worked on. They're all currently hosted on Sketchfab, and they're all kind of how we develop our projects. So Sheila 3D and Romanesque Remains are kind of ongoing projects that we're working on at the moment. And then we have a collaborative project system where Digital Atlas of Early Inscribed Stones and the Omen 3D projects are hosted by UCC and DIAS kind of individually. And they're just projects that we've been extremely lucky to come in and work on. And then just one last slide is how we're developing these projects into the future. So we've partnered with artists like John Flynn or Roisin Doherty, who are based here in Ireland. And we're developing out, taking our 3D scans and then making them into something that's much more consumer friendly and much more kind of community friendly, that we can hand these back. And you can see in the bottom, I think it's the left-hand corner here, that kind of black and red image. That's Clonfert Cathedral, just above the kind of famous doorway. And that red area is where a window is actually being blocked up in the medieval period. So we're using these kind of shading techniques to show changes to the building over time, or additions. So thanks. So I'll hand it back to you, and that's
great. Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you very much, Ed, before. So I've got a couple of questions here already. Of course, please feel free to put more questions into either the chat, or the Q&A is also working as well. So okay, so our first question is that I would love to hear more about the sandcastle procedural modeling aspect of Ed's project, and particularly what advantages you've seen using more artistic tools like Houdini and Unreal, as opposed to something more spatially oriented like Esri's City Engine.
Yeah, thanks, Mason. So the easy answer is, I think as a medievalist, City Engine does tend to be a little bit more oriented to the way that buildings are made now, rather than the way that they were in the past. And modeling is a little bit more, when we made that decision, we made it based on the idea that Houdini is much more malleable. And one of the reasons we called it the Sandcastle project is we really wanted to lean into that like malleability aspect. But also the idea that like a kid goes to the playground and we give you like little buckets that when you turn them over and pick them back up, they look a little like a castle, right? The thing about Houdini is that it's made for technical artists so that they can spin up and create large scenes and things like that really quickly. And so it's like a tool builder rather than a model maker, if that makes sense. So that was kind of our point on that. And actually, to be honest, we've been working so much in Unreal now, but using a plugin so that we link back to Houdini, so that what we're actually doing now is using a thing called scriptable tools in Unreal, where you're sort of you've almost created your own city builder video game, and it's essentially rendering it on the fly and then going through that way. So that was my reticence about using City Engine. I know you could do a lot of cool stuff with it, but we were so sure that everything was going to be kind of muddy and everything that we went the other way. Yeah, it's a good question.
Actually, and there was another question for Ed, but actually Ed has responded to it, but actually has brought Gary potentially into the answer as well here. And the question in the Q&A for Ed was, the line of sight maps are so revealing for embodied viewing and the experience of borders. Do you think this work impacts how historians understand coastal borders as well? Have others used similar methods for coastal harbors? And Ed said that he about viewshed analysis and LOS analysis, and mentioned about towers in Ireland as well. So perhaps that is a dual question for Ed and Gary then as well.
I just can't remember. It might even be your work, Gary. It's like one of those things where I'm like, I can't remember the names of these projects, but I saw these beautiful viewshed analyses projects about harbors in Ireland in particular, and fishing rights being kind of enforced and that kind of stuff. But I can't remember the name of the project.
I can't remember the name of it, but I think it was in Maynooth University, and they were looking at the 18th, 19th century harbor ports around the country. There was another project looking at Martello Towers, and they both used line of sight.
Makes sense. I have a question for both of you, actually, since it was something that both of you touched on quite a lot, and that was, and it's more of a comment rather than a question, but the both of you might comment further on, and that is something that is I won't say near and dear to the heart of all of us digital humanities people, but certainly near and not so dear to the heart of all of us in the digital humanities, and that is the issue of funding and how that impacts sustainability of our projects, and certainly for what it's worth, the NSF wanted us to engage with it in terms of how it assessed its funding, and with a designated sustainability aspect of the project. How do you both address this then? Gary, you hinted at it, but it's very hard when we're dealing with small amounts of money to think about sustainability. Further reflections on that as how we can address this issue in digital humanities, especially when we're doing projects that cost a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it's a big issue, and I've worked at European scale on projects and just worked on local scales in Ireland. So the money can go from 1,500 to a couple of million, and no matter which end you're working on, the afterthought of the project, what happens to this data afterwards, is always outside of the scope of it. I think we need to encourage more funding bodies, in particular the core research funding bodies and national bodies as well, to really engage more with digital and to consider the longevity. So we talked to the Heritage Council in Ireland, and I've kind of tried to encourage funding of GIS projects that would go directly to their heritage map system, but also how we store that data. And then talking to the National Monument Service about the data that we're producing as practitioners and how they should be storing it at a state level as well. They're very big, complex questions that are going to require an awful lot of money. But I don't know, is there a philanthropist out there that wants to fund all of this data storage in the future?
Yeah, that's really, it's critical. And every one of these kind of major projects are saying, okay, what's your data storage? Like, it has to be written into the script of how you're going to do the project. And yet I absolutely agree with you, Gary. No matter what you've said you're going to do, there's going to be something that the funding is going to dry up before you've actually executed all of that data storage planning and all of that. You're going to be doing that kind of on your own time. So just knowing that going in, I think is helpful. There's also one quick project, I'll put it in the chat too, that I think may be useful for some of us, especially if you're doing photogrammetry work. And it's not what it isn't one of the resources that people normally think of, but here at Duke, there's a project called MorphoSource. And they primarily have been working with evolutionary anthropology data, so 3D models of bones and things. And I know this is another Duke plug. I don't really intend it to be, but I know that they're also trying to move into the cultural heritage space more distinctly especially because of what happens with Sketchfab. And they're updating their viewer. They're trying to make it IIIF, so Image Interoperability Framework compatible. And they want our data, and they also will take all of the photos. And that's one of the things that they emphasize, because I completely agree with you. You've got to preserve the photos because the software gets better and your models get better. But yeah, that's a quick plug for them. I think they might be stepping into that void, and I think they're worth working with.
If I can actually ask you a question, in terms of
Yeah.
using the Unreal Engine, how do you manage the ridiculously large files that creates?
So initially, the idea for us is to make sure that it remains on a server, but in the end, what we're going to try to do is get a runtime application out of it in the end, so that you bring a JSON file that's annotations that are created in a web interface, and then we just give you tools that'll make you move things into position. So that's one way we're trying to get around that, but in the actual building of the tool, I wish I had a better answer for you other than, version control when you're doing game engine stuff is like super hard. You don't even get the advantage really of when you're doing visual coding interfaces of having something like GitHub. So you're kind of like cutting and pasting, and training is a big part of it as well. Yeah, and I think really right now we're still using cloud storage, saving directly to networks and then archiving elsewhere. Yeah.
All right, well, we are out of time, I'm afraid. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And just as a quick replug, if you're at the MAA's annual meeting, please attend our DH coffee hour, give us feedback. And then our next meeting will be online. Our next showcase is going to be April 18th with Edition Crafter Mapping the Medieval Woman. And then on May 16th, again, online webinar, Books of Duchesses and Medieval Anglo-Jewish Women. So thank you all very much for joining us. And yeah, these talks will go up on the Medieval Academy's YouTube page as well later on. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to our two presenters as well for your time.